All right. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's program. Good morning. I obviously need more coffee. Neurodiversity in the Workplace, hosted by our ACC NCR Accessibility Affinity Group. For those that may not be familiar with our ACC NCR Affinity groups, we form these groups to connect members and create connections between our large membership. Our accessibility affinity group includes legal professionals with visible and invisible disabilities and their allies. We're thrilled to bring this program to the membership. My name is Mickey Berry, Assistant General Counsel, Education and Government at Workday, and I'm the co-chair of the Accessibility Affinity Group. Before I introduce our speakers, just a few housekeeping items. The program is being recorded, as you were notified when you logged in or heard when you joined. We recommend using the Zoom speaker view for the best experience. If you have any technological issues, we recommend logging off and logging back in. Please keep your sound on mute. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the formal program portion. You're welcome to put your questions in the chat as the program goes on, and we will save those for the Q&A session. You can send them in the chat to all, or you can send them directly to me in the chat, and I'll be happy to moderate questions. We'll also be sharing today's materials and the supplemental materials after the program, so please stay tuned for that. With that, I would love to introduce our speakers today. David Burrick is Junior Counsel in the Financial Disclosures Group within Freddie Mac. Prior to joining Freddie full-time, he completed 2 internships in the legal division and graduated from law school at George Washington University in 2021. He's been participating in disability rights and neurodiversity advocacy and education since 2005. Outside work, David was a varsity cheerleader in undergrad for the South Carolina Gamecocks and has been practicing yoga for over 18 years. And Evita Wosu-Sylvester began her career through Freddie Mac's Attorney Center for Excellence program for recent law grads, where she rotated through various practice areas within the legal division. After almost 2 years, she transitioned into Freddie Mac's multifamily business division, where she specializes in fair lending risk management. She's originally from New Jersey and graduated from Cornell Law School in May of 2020. She's very passionate about disability rights issues and is very excited to be bringing her perspective to the Association of Corporate Counsel. Prior to joining Freddie Mac, Evita worked as a graduate fellow with Legal Assistance of Western New York, where she assisted clients with appealing their case for Social Security disability benefits. In her spare time, she enjoys singing. Okay, let's turn it over to David and Evita.
Mickey, thank you so much for that incredible introduction as I am getting the slides pulled up. Okay, excellent. Everything's showing. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the presentation. I like to first start this presentation with a sort of pseudo-guided meditation. So close your eyes, picture yourself in the shoes that I'm about to describe, follow along. Go back to the days when you're a carefree child, not a practicing lawyer, not burdened with the stressors of the SEC cybersecurity disclosure rules or mistakes your clients might have made that's causing a fire drill for you. You're a child again. Think of something you love to do. Do you like to play sports? Do you like to perform? Do you like to sit in your room and read? What is that activity for you? Now imagine you wake up one day and suddenly you're just not able to do that anymore. Not for any logical reason. Let's say you enjoy theater, but for some reason, when you're on stage, whenever you open your mouth to say the lines that you have memorized and practiced ad infinitum to the point where not only could you do it in your sleep, you are reciting your lines in your sleep. But now, no matter what you do, the words just won't come out. What do you do? How do you handle the situation? How do you go about doing what you enjoy doing? I don't know about any of you, but that's what happened to me when I was in, I think, fifth grade. I was a huge theater kid. I loved performing. I love public speaking. I think it's pretty evident now how comfortable I am addressing a crowd, even off the cuff, for example. But one day I woke up and my Tourette syndrome that I've had since I was 4 years old just decided, you know what? I'm not going to let you speak anymore. I've decided you lost your privileges of reciting and or saying anything that you've carefully thought about or rehearsed. It's like a stutter, but not a normal stutter where you repeat one sound over and over before the word eventually comes out. The words would get caught in my throat, and similar to almost ADHD paralysis, I physically could not get my mouth to form the words. So what did I do? I learned to be an excellent off the cuff speaker. I learned to address crowds like this with no practice, just a little bit, 5 minutes of running through an outline in my head and then go for it. So that's been part of my experience with being neurodivergent, with my experience with Tourette syndrome. So with that out of the way, now we have a question for the audience. Please come off mute, say it out loud, address us all if you want, or put your answers in the chat. I believe we have someone monitoring the chat. What do you think these three people, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Tesla, and the current pop star melodrama singer Lorde, what do these three people have in common? What do we think? Put your answers in the chat. We are monitoring this. This is an interactive presentation. Y'all didn't know you're going to have to talk today. Guess what? Here we are. We have some answers. All neurodiverse. They're all neurodivergent. That's correct. I guess something about the story I told earlier gave this away, but that's fine. The correct answer is they are all likely neurodivergent. Of course, we can't speak definitively about Mozart and Tesla because they're dead hundreds of years ago. But researchers speculate that Mozart, like me, may have had Tourette syndrome. Tesla, it's been, as I'll say, estimated, more so speculated, that he was on the autism spectrum. And Lorde has spoken very publicly about her experience with synesthesia, which, for those of you who are not aware, imagine synesthesia as your senses being crossed. She's described smelling or seeing sounds associated with color, smelling certain sounds, senses across. It's pretty cool, actually. Please read her interviews when you get a chance. But that sort of brings us to our central question of the presentation. What is this concept of neurodiversity? Avita, would you like to explain more, please?
Sure, thanks, David. So, neurodiversity refers to variation in the human brain when it comes to the way that people socialize, the way that they learn, their level of attention, their mood, and other mental functions. Next slide. The term was first coined in 1998 by sociologist Judy Singer, who helped popularize the concept along with journalist Harvey Bloom. And this concept first became especially popular amongst the autistic community. But as popular as this concept has been, it has received quite a bit of criticism from some disability advocates who feel that this whole movement doesn't really reflect the realities of those individuals who have what are considered quote unquote high support needs. But we'll get into that discussion a little later. But for now, if we just base our understanding of neurodiversity on the basic definition of having variations in the brain, then naturally all humans are neurodiverse because we all have unique brains and we don't all think or act in the same way. But for our purposes, when we talk about neurodiversity, we are talking about those who may think or act in ways that society may consider to be abnormal or outside of the norm, and unfortunately, in ways that can lead to marginalization.
So Judy Singer is our girl here. I love this definition personally. Neurodiversity is a state of nature to be respected. It's an analytical tool for examining social issues. At the end of the day, it's just an argument for the conservation and facilitation and respect, really, of all forms of human diversity.
Another definition describes neurodiversity as the virtually infinite neurocognitive variability within Earth's human population. It's also described as the diversity of human brains and minds, and my favorite is a concept where neurological differences are to be recognized and respected as any other human variation.
Quick little vocabulary lesson here. We're throwing a lot of words at all of you. We have neurodiversity, neurodivergent, and neurotypical. There's a lot of overlap in these terms, but in a sense, neurodiversity is this larger concept of all of the ways in which our brains can work differently. It's people who don't have any sort of diagnosed condition. It's also people with ADHD or dyslexia. It's the whole shebang of all of the possibilities. When I'm talking about neurodivergent, we are talking about people with diagnosable conditions that are outside of the norm of the way we understand brains to work. People with ADHD, to continue using that example. On the other hand, neurotypical is the opposite of neurodivergent. Neurotypical means you don't have anything like that. So, to put it in basic math terms, I know lawyers were afraid of math, but I promise it's easy. Neurodivergent plus neurotypical equals neurodiversity. So when it comes to neurodivergent conditions, there are several conditions, disorders, whatever word you want to use, that fall under this category. The biggest ones people think of are autism spectrum disorder, dyslexia, dyscalculia, aka dyslexia with numbers, epilepsy, hyperlexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, or in my own experience especially, obsessive compulsive disorder and Tourette syndrome. There is very little agreement about what is and isn't a neurodivergent condition. Some people say any diagnosis can make you neurodivergent. I don't necessarily agree because I don't think a broken arm, for example, would necessarily affect the way my brain works. But we have these concentric circles to show how expanding definitions of neurodiversity encompasses more conditions. For example, all neurodiversity advocates agree that autism, ADHD, Tourette's and other tic disorders, and dyslexia are under the category of neurodiversity. But people don't always agree about epilepsy or synesthesia, or some people even expand the definition to include borderline personality disorder. Personally, I like that. I think any condition in which your brain works differently is a neurodivergent condition. And for my own definition, I'm not putting this on anybody else, that includes borderline personality disorder. So with that little bit of introduction, we have another poll question for you all.
Hi, David. Can I ask a question before you go ahead?
If it's okay with you, we are planning to save questions for the end. We have lots of time built in for Q&A. If you want to put it in the chat so you don't forget, feel free. If you want to just come on later and ask, that's fine too.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thanks.
Oh, no worries.
Okay, so out of curiosity, David and I would be interested to know whether you guys have heard the term neurodiversity before this presentation, or if this is your first time. And if you have, we'd be interested to know where. So if you're comfortable, go ahead and type a yes in the chat if you've heard the term before and tell us where if you can, or a no if you haven't, and I'll give you a few seconds. So feel free to type in the chat.
While they're typing, Evita, when did you first hear about this term?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the term neurodiversity has been around in the disability community for a long time, but I don't think there's a ton of mainstream knowledge. I first heard the term as recently as 2019 when I was part of a summer internship and disability advocacy program for people with disabilities. So I was surrounded by people with all kinds of conditions, including neurodivergent conditions. So I learned a lot about how different people like to identify. How about you, David?
So I've been doing this work, neurodiversity advocacy, really advocating for myself with Tourette syndrome since, Lord, like 2005, since I was a literal child. But I didn't hear the term neurodiversity until I think it was like late 2016 when I was still in business school. I was doing some extracurricular work for a Dean's DEI council. Been doing that work for that long. And someone said, well, what about neurodiversity? How can we blend that into the work that we're doing here? Necessarily, we all said, oh, tell us more. What is that? And she explained the basic concept of neurodiversity, and it clicked. I said, oh, wait, that's me, Tourette syndrome. Hello. Love this term. I'm going to start using that too. So it looks like a lot of people in the chat have heard the term neurodiversity, heard it before, but couldn't tell you where. You know what? Points for honesty. I love it. Thank you. Some people have heard it from therapists, from their own diagnoses, from friends, from the media. I love just how much traction this term is finally getting. Some people are so confused by the term. Great. Amazing. We have something to talk about. I love it. Hopefully this presentation can give you a little bit more clarity about the term. And if not, it's all about the Q&A that's coming up. So stay tuned, everybody. Now, neurodiversity is it a disability? Interesting question. At the end of the day, it's really two sides of the same coin. So the concept itself, as we've mentioned, is very controversial. There is little agreement. Some people say, oh, well, if you're just advocating for acceptance, then you're erasing the needs that some people may have. Some people may require a lot more support to navigate life with their conditions than me, for example. Thankfully, knock on wood, I'm good. I don't need a lot of support, but some people do. Many people who are low functioning, I prefer to say much higher support requirements, they're unable to communicate effectively, so they do need this support. But a really big point with this concept of neurodiversity, while we advocate for acceptance of other neurodivergent conditions, just like we advocate for rights and justice for other marginalized communities, it's very important to point out that race or sexual orientation differences do not functionally disable a person, whereas neurological disorders, conditions, etc. can. So with that being said, what is a disability? Is neurodivergence a disability? How do these concepts intersect? To introduce us to that concept, Evita?
Thanks. So before we answer that question, we can't have a discussion about neurodiversity and disability without talking about the official definition of disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the ADA defines disability as having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And this includes people who have a history or a record of such an impairment, even if they don't currently have a disability. And it also includes individuals who do not have a disability, but may be regarded by society as having a disability. And Congress always intended for this definition to be construed as broadly as possible because they understood that there was so much diversity within the community, and they knew that people were going to try to create hierarchies and gatekeep who was disabled and who was not disabled, or who was more disabled and more deserving of support. And in the early days, we saw the Supreme Court try and reinforce these hierarchies by narrowing the definition. And in 2008, in response to this, the Bush administration passed the ADA Amendments Act, which reiterated the broad nature of the definition and helped to clarify that disability also includes learning disabilities like autism and ADHD. Next slide. Before we get into neurodiversity's connection to disability, I want to quickly talk about person-first identification versus identity-first identification. So throughout this presentation, you may hear us say the phrase person with a disability or disabled person or person with autism or autistic person. And that is because there are two main ways in which people within the community prefer to identify. So those who prefer person first may feel that although they have a disability, it is a very small part of who they are or not part of their identity at all. Whereas people that prefer identity first may see disability as being a major part of their identity, and they don't necessarily see the word disability as something negative that they need to shy away from. And some, like myself, just don't really care either way and use them both interchangeably. But sometimes, depending on the disability, it may make more sense to use one over the other. A best practice is to always ask the person how they would like to identify, and when in doubt, you can start with person first, but be prepared to pivot. And if you're in a position where you can't ask anyone and you're really concerned about it, you can choose to use them both interchangeably to acknowledge the preferences of both groups.
Now, a borderline pedantic distinction that we have to make here. For myself, I prefer identity first, call me disabled, but there's a linguistic challenge with that. There is no adjective for Tourette syndrome that makes identity first language possible. So despite preferences, sometimes you do have to use one or the other. But that being said, again, brings us back to our central question. Is neurodiversity a disability?
So is neurodiversity a disability? So as we stated earlier, neurodiversity is all about the ways in which the brain can work differently. And there hasn't been agreement amongst the community about neurodiversity even being a thing. So the term neurodiversity itself is a political term and a movement, and it's not a disability or a diagnosis. However, the conditions that fall under neurodiversity are disabilities because many neurodivergent individuals do experience impairments that substantially limit their activities. And many that identify as neurodiverse also identify as having disabilities because they understand that disability is a legal term that enables them to receive certain civil rights that they may need under the ADA. And to further understand why people would choose to identify as having a disability, it's also important to understand the models of disability. So the medical model of disability describes the disabled person as having some kind of deficit. And the ultimate goal is to try to get this person to be as quote unquote normal as possible. Whereas the social model of disability focuses on disability being a civil rights issue. And under this model, the problem is not with the person. The problem is society that often creates barriers to accessibility or inclusion. And the social model rejects the idea that an individual has to be quote unquote normal to live a great life. And it urges society to work to accommodate people. But this is not to say that people should not seek medical treatments or cures if they feel that that is best for them. The medical community still plays a huge role in the lives of many people with disabilities. But it is simply to say that society should also recognize that not everyone can or wants to be healed or cured, and that people should just be accepted as they are.
A really important point here to be made about the two models of disability. I'm just gonna skip ahead and say that disabilities, neurodivergent conditions, etc., must be analyzed using both the medical and the social models because there are both medical and social aspects to both. Speaking of my own experience with Tourette syndrome, there are comorbidities or co-occurring conditions. It's very, very common to have both OCD and ADHD along with Tourette syndrome. Personally, I only have OCD. So at the end of the day, a lot of these another comorbidity I deal with is severe, borderline life-threatening insomnia that I have treated. My doctors are helping me. I sleep normally every night. That's why I am cripplingly addicted to caffeine. That's a problem. We'll get there later. But my insomnia is a medical condition that comes from my Tourette syndrome. That insomnia is going to disable me no matter what's going on in society. If I've gone 48 hours without sleeping, I'm going to be functionally disabled no matter what's going on. My Tourette's, on the other hand, I'm lucky enough that my tics are mild enough to where they don't actually impede on my life anymore at all. Thankfully, that stuttering tic I talked about at the very beginning of this presentation has gone away. But I do often still sometimes face prejudice due to my Tourette's. So Tourette's itself reflects the social model of disability to where it's more about how I'm treated in society, whereas comorbidities, insomnia, reflects more of the medical model because that is a deficit for me. Also worth mentioning is a concept called masking. Neurodivergent individuals, very specifically those of us with Tourette's and autism, tend to be able to mask our conditions. We're able to hide the behaviors that our conditions exhibit. With Tourette's, I can hold in my tics. I can stop twitching. I can force myself to not stutter, but I can't do it very long. that's not natural for me. That's not how my brain works. I can hold it in for a minute or two max, but if I hold it in for too long, it becomes physically painful and just that much harder to hide. So that's been my experience. You've heard a lot about it, but I'm not the only one. Earlier, we've talked about other celebrities, and recently, Lorde has been a lot more vocal about, no, I'm sorry, not Lorde, Billie Eilish, talking about her. She had a great article in, I want to say it was Vanity Fair, no, or Variety magazine, about how she's come to really embrace her Tourette syndrome and stop masking publicly wherever feasible. What about you all? Feel free to say out loud, put it in the chat. Can you think of any other vocally neurodivergent celebrities? An important point here, we don't want to speculate, we don't want to assume. I'm talking about celebrities who have been vocal about their own neurodivergent conditions and experiences. I know I love asking this question because every single time I learn about more people, I think this is how I actually learned that the Scottish singer Lewis Capaldi has Tourette's. So if anyone has any other ideas, please tell everyone. Yes, Simone Biles. I've heard her talk about ADHD. She's very brave talking about that for sure. Lewis Capaldi, Dash Mihawk. I'm not familiar with Dash Mihawk. I got some research to do. Thank you. Ooh, Tim Burton, Dan Aykroyd. Yeah, no, these are great. I love that people are talking about more experiences with their neurodivergent conditions in the media. I think it's doing an amazing job for representation, especially. So we all know of or have heard of someone or have someone close in our lives who is neurodivergent. And for those of us who are close to neurodivergent people, we see a lot of the challenges. But there are gifts with a lot of these conditions. Speaking for myself with Tourette syndrome, hyper-focus can absolutely be a superpower in my role doing 34 Act reporting when I need to really deep focus and get a lot of work done and shut out all distractions. My observational skills are heightened because new tics pop up with absolutely no warning. I need to be very aware of what's going on in my body and my brain to learn how to overcome these tics, because a coping mechanism for a tic that I had 2 years ago probably isn't going to work with a new one that popped up today, or even coping mechanisms that worked then don't work now. So I need to be incredibly creative to figure out what's going to work for me. And I need to very quickly observe what's going on in my body to figure out these new strategies. Of course, this lends itself to innovative thinking and heightened cognitive control. I'm not going to sit here and read all of this to you. That's a lot of words. You'll get these slides. I love this slide because it really does a great job of highlighting that, yes, there are challenges with being neurodivergent, but at the end of the day, we are able to harness our conditions as gifts. Now, this whole concept of neurodiversity and really learning about it is just a new application of empathy. It really forces us to think critically about how our own brains work, about how we think, about how we learn. And with that, we have some more resources and some lessons for you all.
Thanks, David. So here are a variety of resources that I have compiled. And I think these are all great resources if you just want to learn more about neurodiversity, but they also explain how employers can make their workforces more inclusive for neurodiverse individuals. And while I'm sure many of you might be doing some of this work at your companies, there's always room for improvement. And we hope that this presentation will spark conversation about how your various company organizations can be more intentional in incorporating neurodiversity and disability as a whole into your programming. And our goal with this presentation is to continue to try to shift the thinking of disability being strictly a medical issue. And how do we start to see it as an asset with all of the gifts that David just mentioned? So this book is a great first start. It's called Great Minds Think Differently by Haley Moss, and it's a play on the phrase great minds think alike. And it's the idea that different should be celebrated. And it talks about all the ways in which neurodiversity can actually be an asset in the legal profession. And it's meant to give people the tools on how to support their neurodivergent colleagues in the workplace. And one thing to note, so this book was written by Haley Moss, and she actually made history as the first openly autistic lawyer in the state of Florida. And this book is available on the American Bar Association website, and we have the link here if you're interested in purchasing it. So, and you'll get the deck at the end of the presentation, like we mentioned. So the next resource after this is neurodiversityhub.com, which is a great website where we actually got a majority of our research from for this presentation. And on this site, there are resources for students, universities, and employers. We also have a Harvard Business Review article that talks about neurodiversity as a competitive advantage in the workforce. Next is EARN Network. So the Employer Assistance and Resource Network is a great website that functions as a comprehensive guide to disability inclusion. And they offer lots of training resources on disability and neurodiversity specifically. And they actually include a neurodiversity toolkit that's linked here. And staff is also available for questions. Disability In is a nonprofit whose whole job is to help corporations with their disability inclusion efforts. And Freddie Mac is actually a corporate sponsor of Disability In. And as a corporate sponsor, we have access to a variety of resources on all things disability, including neurodiversity. And in addition to training resources, most notably, they hold a conference every year where college and graduate students with disabilities get to network with representatives from various companies, and they can actually come out of it with job opportunities. So I'm sure that it's very well possible that many of your companies are already affiliated with this organization. And if they're not, then maybe this could be the first step for you to possibly introduce this organization to your company. Next slide. So here are our Freddie resources. So what are we doing at Freddie? So we have our Neurodiversity at Work program, which is currently being run by the Workforce Diversity team at Freddie Mac, and it's currently focused on hiring people with autism. Next, we have our Abilities BRG, which would be equivalent to the Accessibility Affinity group at ACC or any other affinity group at any of your companies, which David and I are both members of. And this BRG is for employees with disabilities, but also allies. And we get together and we talk about how we can make the company more inclusive for people with all kinds of disabilities. And we host a variety of events throughout the year, particularly in October for National Disability Employment Awareness Month. My current role on the team is the Disability In Liaison, and I attend their monthly meetings where everyone talks about how they are currently doing at their various organizations, and I bring the information back to the group. And lastly, our last resource is HR. So anyone that has questions about disability accommodations here at Freddie Mac are able to reach out to HR through our HR Connect system. And that's the end of our presentation.
Yeah, so that's the end of the presentation. But as you've noticed, we have a lot of time on the calendar. We very much do this on purpose. The whole point of this presentation is an introduction. We're here to start the conversation with you all. Now, we give you permission to ask us anything, and I truly mean anything. Ask us about Freddie Mac, our own experience with disability accommodations. Ask me about what it's like to have Tourette's. I know everything is coming from a well-intentioned place, and now you get the chance to ask everything you want. Evita does not have Tourette syndrome, but Evita has a wealth of experience she can also talk about. Feel free, and questions in the chat, come on camera, come off mute, say it out loud if you want. I do want to start with one message that was sent to me. Let me stop sharing, I don't need this anymore. One message that was sent me